Hello everybody, I'm Matt Anderson and welcome to The Road Not Taken, how ordinary people got out of their own way and you can too. I'm extremely excited to introduce our guest today, Jenna Benn Shersher, who's joining us from Philadelphia. Jen, if you could just say a few words to introduce yourself to the audience and kind of, let them know what we're going to be talking about today, that would be wonderful.
Yeah, so what we're going to be talking about is how I was able to overcome a very rare cancer diagnosis at the age of 29 and how I chose to find meaning in suffering and turn the lessons that I learned from that experience into my own nonprofit.
Okay, well, it's an amazing summary. Yeah, I can't wait to learn more about this. And just to kick things off from a sort of a very practical standpoint, you know, if you had to pick one thing that's helped you most in terms of, I guess, I would say handling adversity probably is the best example for yourself. What do you think that is?
I think I try and look at adversity as an opportunity. So you can choose to become overwhelmed by it, or you can choose to learn from it and have it propel you forward. So in my case, with a cancer diagnosis, I hear countless times from people that it forces them to retreat. And in a way, I did quite the opposite and was very public with my journey. So, I think I've really tried to recognize that there's a fine line between excitement and feeling terrified. And so using that and reminding myself of that, not only when I was sick, but also as I've continued to grow the nonprofit. And to embrace that.
That's a brilliant line, by the way. I've got to listen to that again and get it right. But there's a fine line between excitement and being terrified. I had someone on about 3 weeks ago who runs the world's largest B2B sales podcast. And I was asking him, this is slightly off track, but it is and it isn't, about the imposter syndrome in terms of interviewing people that, are very well known and you could be very intimidated by. And I imagine in your world, you've had that, I assume you've had that experience from time to time, with fundraising where you talk, I can't believe I'm talking to this person, and all of a sudden you start getting butterflies. But the best way he phrased it was, if you're not getting butterflies regularly, then you're not moving fast enough. He didn't embellish, but he was basically saying, if you want a dull comfort zone lifestyle, then sure, stay in your comfort zone. But if you actually want to get a lot out of life, you've got to get that feeling. Yeah. I love you saying that. Now, I've got to ask this. So how long was it after firstly, talk us through the story a little bit, to give it some perspective, because you mentioned it briefly. Yeah. You said you were 29 years old. Talk us through kind of, what happened?
Yeah, so I want to say back in February of 2010, I came back from a trip where I led 30 young adults to Germany through work. I was traveling the world at that point. Every couple of months was going on these incredible journeys. And after I came back, I then went to Argentina to visit a good friend. And so I was really pretty much gone for a good 2.5 week period. And when I came back, I was just totally wiped out, and in a way that I knew was not right. I assumed in the beginning that I wasn't able to keep up with the lifestyle in Buenos Aires, where they're going out for dinner at 10 p.m. and you're staying up until 8 or 9 in the morning and doing it all over again. So I made all these sort of, excuses about, well, I'm getting older, I'm 29, I can't really do that anymore. But when I came back, my health really started to decline. So I went into the emergency room with what they thought was viral meningitis. Oh, wow. A couple months later, I came back with a pinched nerve. And then I was having these flu-like symptoms that were hitting every 3 to 4 weeks. And the doctors kept saying, you have the flu. And I kept saying, I don't have the flu. So I knew internally something was wrong. And then I started to lose weight. And it was not the kind of weight that I wanted to lose. I was already sort of active and working out fairly regularly, and within about a month, I had lost 15 pounds, and it was noticeable, and people were commenting. And so I just thought, well, maybe I'm stressed, or I've changed my diet, but I knew deep down there was something wrong. And finally, I went back to the orthopedist with, again, another pinched nerve, and she said to me, Jenna, we haven't taken any scans. Let's just see what's going on internally. And sure enough, later that afternoon, I received a phone call from my primary care physician who told me that I had cancer.
Mm-hmm.
And life as I knew it changed. And, you know, we had to figure out what kind of cancer it was. We knew that I had these multiple masses in my mediastinum, or my upper chest area. They weren't sure what kind of cancer it was, but it was looking more and more like a blood cancer, given that I was young.
Mm-hmm.
And there was an initial assumption that I had Hodgkin's lymphoma, given that, you know, I was young, I was active, otherwise had been healthy. And I had actually a very bad case of mono, like years ago in high school. And so that was sort of the track that we were going down. And after I had a biopsy and that was sent out to the National Cancer Institute out in Maryland, they then realized that it was not Hodgkin's lymphoma, but was gray zone lymphoma, which is this really rare blood cancer that at the time, back in 2010, so December of 2010, there were about 200 of us worldwide. And there was no information, no research. There was a Wikipedia page that had 2 sentences that essentially said, this disease has features of Hodgkin's and non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. I mean, it didn't even have a real name. It, you know, gray zone, it's like, it's not a technical term. It's just kind of this in-between. And in many ways, it was very foreshadowing of how the rest of my story has sort of unfolded. I had to get very used to living in this in-between state, in this gray existence of somewhere between being well and being sick, somewhere between Hodgkin's lymphoma and B-cell lymphoma, which is, or non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. So I had to kind of embrace the uncertainty of this diagnosis. There were no statistics out there that could tell me what my prognosis was. There was virtually no one that I could connect with that could tell me I was going to be okay. Mm-hmm. So I had a decision to make. I could either, you know, just give into the fear and retreat, or I could find my voice and be really loud. And it became a very easy decision at the time that I was not going to retreat, that I needed to find my voice. I needed to figure out a new normal for myself. But that decision of being loud and exposing myself throughout my journey was wonderful in many ways, and had, you know, some serious repercussions down the road too, because I think people started to assume that I wanted to be public about all aspects of my life. And, you know, sometimes they assume that I continue to want to be that way. And that is very different than the life I'm living right now. Sure. So it's been an interesting shift.
How long did it take you from the, you know, when you heard the diagnosis? I mean, I've no idea. I've never been in your shoes. I mean, certainly my father died of cancer, so I've experienced it closely. But I mean, how long did it take you from that moment to sort of decide, okay, this is how I'm going to handle this? I mean, was there some period of time when you were shocked and not sure what to do?
Yes. So when my physician called me and said, you have cancer, I was in such a state of denial, I didn't hear her correctly. I just said, oh, that's great news. And she said, I don't think you heard me. And I said, oh, I don't have cancer. She said, no, Jenna, you have cancer. So like immediately there was this like, no. This is not true. This is not happening. And I had this real like physical reaction to it. I mean, where it was very out of body, where I just completely collapsed in a parking lot and was hyperventilating. And then when I got home, I told the physician that she had to call my parents because I couldn't deliver this kind of news to them. And when I got home, I saw my parents and they turned white, and I could tell that they were talking to her, and we just kind of held each other and cried. And it was really, I want to say, like a couple hours later where I just said, I'm going to beat this and I'm going to figure it out. And I'm going to, you know, choose to fight cancer with the tenacity in which I have chosen to live. And it wasn't even an option for me to think about battling or fighting or living in any other way. You know, these words, I put them in quotes because they can be trigger words for different people. For me, the way that I talk about my cancer experiences, it felt like a battle. That's how I envisioned it. I envisioned cancer as this horribly ugly very weak boxer.
Mm-hmm.
And so every time I was going into chemotherapy, I just thought about knocking her out. And I'm not really an aggressive person, but that's how I had to picture it. And, you know, it was really something to go through this and to just figure out what strategies you need to implement in order just to get through the day to day. But I didn't really, it's not that I didn't question if I was going to live. I questioned that a lot. I was faced with my own mortality, and there was no certainty. And there were many experiences along the way that were very dicey and very complicated. But I knew that I was going to go out fighting really hard. And so that did not take long for me to come up with that strategy. I think also, you know, part of why I thought the way that I did was because it just seemed so outrageous. I mean, I was a 29-year-old, otherwise healthy person. There was no history of blood cancer in my family. Mm-hmm. I had lived a really healthy lifestyle. So it just seemed insane. It seemed ridiculous. So I felt like I was going to manage my situation with an element of humor, and I was going to be really loud about it. And yeah, so that's what I did.
So when you say you decided to live it out loud, what exactly did that entail?
So it didn't start out with much thought. Okay. I just knew that I was going to be very determined, and I was going to use every skill set in my toolkit to try and manage this. So that's from creating binders and highlighting all different things that I needed to know. I became super organized, and that's how I am normally. Mm-hmm. Just in my day to day, like, you know, I was the kid at university that was studying a month in advance for finals. I was mm-hmm. never the last minute kind of person. So I looked at this as my biggest test. And so all of the things that I did by creating my team, my support team, my medical team, my cancer team, like my friends, you know, I had like different buckets for them, and they were serving different purposes throughout and continue to. And so I just really kind of drew on the things that worked from past experiences in managing crises and tried to implement them. And sometimes it worked and sometimes it didn't. So that's what I did. I can't remember what your question was. I'm sorry.
Oh, well, so did you start a blog or something? Like, how did you start?
Yes.
Because you said you decided to live out loud. So what did that look like?
Yeah.
You talked about, obviously, you built a support team and educated yourself as best you could. But you did quite a bit more than that, didn't you?
Yeah. Yes, I did. So, you know, in the beginning, I remember, I mean, I did everything wrong in terms of the communication piece. Okay. So I texted my best friends that I had cancer. That's how I issued the news. One of them almost got into a car accident, was driving on the highway. Shouldn't have been looking at her phone anyways, but still, that's a horrible way of relaying the information. Then I started sending out emails, and I inevitably left people off. And then we're getting all these phone calls. And to be honest, when you have bad news to share, you don't want to keep rehashing it. No. You don't have the same horrible conversation over and over. It depletes you. And I knew fairly quickly that I needed to preserve my energy. So what I did initially was I started a blog that was private. And it was by invitation only. And then I pissed off a lot of people in the process because there were more than just my closest family and friends that wanted to know. Mm-hmm. And so I opened it up. But I didn't promote it. I just opened it up. And within a couple of days, there were a couple thousand people that were looking at this blog. Wow. And that's with, you know, I was not intending to be a blogger. I was not intending to create some public platform. It was just a space for me to create effective and efficient updates about my health and to let people know what was going on so I could preserve my energy. And then that blog kind of turned into something else where it really turned into a coping strategy of mine, where I would wake up in the morning and the blog post was written. It was in my head. It just had to come out. Mm-hmm. And I realized quickly that this was not just about updates. This became kind of a space for me to write poetry, to write stories, to reflect on what I was experiencing and what my innermost thoughts and feelings were. And so I was very bold in the sense that I allowed myself to be really vulnerable publicly. Mm-hmm. But really out of necessity. It was not something that was premeditated. Like, let me figure out how to create a very public profile. Right. It was not the intention, but it's what happened. And in turn, by being so vulnerable and being so open about my experiences, people started writing in from all walks of life and were sharing with me very intimate, dark secrets, things that I never imagined I would be a keeper of. Mm-hmm. And it provided me with a lot of comfort and made me feel like in some way what I was going through was empowering others to come forward and share their experiences, and helped in turn to eradicate, I think, some of the shame that's associated with crisis.
Crisis?
So, crisis, yeah. I mean, I think we're so scared to say the word cancer, and there's so many other words like cancer that we're scared to admit to because we don't know what it means necessarily. But I was really, as I continued to go through this, I realized that my writing, and then through the formation of Twist Out Cancer, the organization I started, that it really became this sort of retaliation or battle cry to that shame. It was to try and say, it's okay to come forward and to be vulnerable and to share your experiences. And the more we don't do that, the inevitable shame, it's inevitable that shame will be there, essentially. Like, you know, I think when people keep things inside and internalize it, it's because we're scared of how people will respond. But I saw quite the opposite, that the more I shared, the more the world seemed to open up to me. And the more opportunities there seemed to be available. So it was incredible. So it was this ripple effect, really.
It's interesting you talk about the shame attached, because I've never thought of that. Where and I'd certainly relate to when you talk about other things that have shame attached in terms of sexual abuse and other kinds of, I guess, the hidden problems in people's homes, alcoholism and so on. But I've never attached it to cancer. Can you elaborate on that? So I'm trying to connect the dots. Is it in the sense that people usually isolate themselves, or actually is it more the idea that people avoid you if they think you're sick because they don't know how to handle it or it makes them uncomfortable? And is that kind of what you're alluding to in terms of?
Yeah. And I think because we don't know enough about what causes it, that people make some assumptions, like we've made bad choices, or, you know, it must be because she ate this or she drank that or whatever. I think we try and fill in the gaps sometimes when we don't have the answers to things. And I mean, we can see even, it's a very clear one, the stigma with lung cancer. We make the assumption that someone must have smoked, when I know quite a number of young adults like me with stage 4 disease that never touched cigarettes, you know? So I think, and I think that ultimately when we don't talk about what's hard and we don't talk about what's going on medically, we have this tendency to just keep it inside. And then there's so much useful information that could be shared and learned from that is just lost. And so for me, I wanted to make people feel empowered to be able to come forward and to be upfront about what they were experiencing and feeling, so that other people wouldn't feel that they had to retreat and had to feel shameful of what they were going through, or embarrassed, or unwilling to be a part of things. I think, you know, when you go from being in the land of the well to the land of the sick, it can be very isolating, and it can be quite easy to just retreat and to not open up and talk to people about what's going on. That's the easier choice, in my opinion. The harder choice is to try and figure out your new normal and how to keep on living and how do you exist in this new space. So.
And then how did the blog help you? I'm guessing it was a journey of different emotions. Initially, you know, you said it was about just giving updates, and then you discovered that there was a astonishing amount of interest and support, and then other people were confiding in you. How was it helpful to you in terms of fighting cancer?
Yeah, I mean, I think it allowed me to have a space where I could write, which I didn't know I needed, but I needed it. And you know, writing was never my forte. It was actually something I dreaded. Usually, you know, when I would have to write a paper for school, it took me a lot longer than most, and I never really thought of myself as being someone that had a way with words. And I think that in a way, because I had all this time on my hands, and like I said, you know, there's a couple of instances where I had these sort of like out of body experiences. So like when I heard those 3 words, "you have cancer," I had this physical response. And sometimes in the morning I would wake up and not realize that I had all these things I needed to say, and it would just come out of me. Like I would sit down, not with any intention of writing, but it just had to happen. I mean, it was like, it was just not totally up to me. That's how it felt at times. And the more that I did it, the better I felt. And then in turn started to create this community that I needed, but I wasn't aware I didn't have, and wasn't aware that it didn't exist until I started creating it. You know, it was none of it was premeditated. None of what I did was premeditated. It really was, this feels right, I'm going to do this. And in a way, when I reflect on my cancer experience, it is an incredibly selfish experience. You have to be so inwardly focused to get through it. And it's horrible. And relationships can fall apart and can be strained because you are just trying to survive. And it's so hard to be giving to your family and friends in the way that you're used to. And so in a way, the writing also was very, at the time, selfish, but then I realized that it was helping people. And then once I realized that I had this audience, it kind of shifted, I think, the way that I wrote and the way that I saw the blog. And it really turned from a place of updates to a coping mechanism, a coping strategy for me.
Well, and maybe you're being a bit harsh on the word selfish. I mean, I think of it as cathartic, you know, just as, I mean, part of it must have also been a release of all these things that you, I mean, I can't imagine are so hard to try and get your head around at all. I've got to ask you, because something you said really jumped out at me, that when you talked about how the words would just come out of me, and then you said something and it wasn't totally up to me. I think that's what you said. What did you mean by that?
You know, so I mean, I would say that I'm a spiritual person for sure, but there are certain situations in my life where I just feel like, where you just feel like you're being guided. And I can't tell you who or what, but I just didn't feel like all of my decisions were totally in my hands. And when I would sit down to write, I had never experienced ever having a paper written before I sat down, whereas I would really wake up in the morning and felt like a birthing process where it just came out. And there was no thought that was put into it. It was like my hands were just going through the motions. And I can't say that I have felt that in a very long time, but it happened quite a bit while I was sick. And it happened quite a bit after. And it happens every once in a while now where things feel like, you know, this is what I'm supposed to be doing. And I think that while I was sick, I did so much internal work and had so much time to reflect on life and what I wanted and what I envisioned for myself if I ever was to get past this. And, you know, I think that as a 29, 30-year-old, like I did more internal work than I think most get to do in a lifetime.
Yeah, sure.
So I just felt very clued in, very, like I was listening in a way to the world around me that I wasn't before. My eyes were open in a way. And I even talk about in some of my writing that I would see in hypercolor. And it's interesting, like when your senses start to be deprived. So for example, like for me, it was taste. And then there was the physical pieces too, where, you know, things felt different, physically. Like, you know, I was losing the ability in my hands and feet. They were becoming tingling. So as things start to change physiologically, I talked about seeing the world in this state of hypercolor. And I really meant it, where the colors around me were different. They were brighter. They were the way that I was seeing people, it was like they were glowing. And we could argue that I was on a lot of medication that was helping, but at the same time, this wasn't just like in the hospital setting. This was throughout that period of treatment where just the more and more I became deprived of things, the more other senses started to sort of activate in different ways, you know? So I think that was part of it too. Where, you know, I couldn't go outside. I couldn't be with family and friends in the same way that I used to. And so my inner world kind of developed and my writing developed. It's just a really interesting process of making peace with things that I was losing, but also sort of acquiring new skills and new abilities.
How many people have you met that are cancer survivors? I mean, approximately, if you had to guess.
Thousands.
Thousands. Like,
yeah.
A couple thousand, 10,000?
Well, I mean, so like for, you know, like through Brushes with Cancer, which is a program that we run, we've had 18,000 people participate in some way.
18,000?
So that's not all, yeah, so that's not all cancer survivors, but that's also caregivers, previvors. So yeah, a lot.
And then there's all the people you've interacted with online. Where I'm going with this, it wasn't to be necessarily to pin it down to an actual number, but it was more about how many other people have you met then that have had similar experiences to you in terms of the, I mean, maybe I should be more specific, I suppose, in terms of, let's start with the outer body experiences. I mean, or is that something you don't talk about that much?
No, I think it's a good question. I don't think it's something that I talk about often, like, what was it like for you right away, right when you heard those words? But I have heard of people that have had, I think definitely physical responses, right? Like immediate physical responses to it. But it's not something that I focus all that much on when I'm talking to new people. I'm usually focusing on like where they're at now. So I don't know. It's a really good question. I've never been asked that. And I would have to imagine that it wasn't just me, that there were many people that, you know, when you hear information like that, your brain has to catch up, right? So you have that physiological response that happens immediately. And then you have the time after to process it. I mean, I was even thinking, this isn't like a great example, but in the recent shooting in San Diego in the synagogue over Passover, the husband of Lori, who passed away, you know, immediately ran to his wife and then fainted upon seeing her. And that's a physiological response to trauma, right? To crisis. And so I think, I mean, he couldn't even, his brain shut off, like couldn't even process. And I think that happens a lot. I have to imagine that happens a lot. And the question is then what do you do with yourself once your mind starts to catch up? How do you manage?
Yeah. I mean, it sounds like you had quite a lot of those experiences, as you said, throughout that process. What I most want to ask right now is about the role that your thinking plays in the positive outcome of beating cancer. I mean, I know it's a gray area, but it's been written about for quite some time because it was the first thing I did when my dad was diagnosed, and this was a long time ago. When was this? This was in the late 90s. There were a couple of books about people that had things that they'd done to beat cancer. One was called Love, Medicine and Miracles, but there was another book as well. I want to say Bernie Siegel. I'm probably getting the names wrong, but anyway, before I start embarrassing myself with getting things all wrong, can you speak to that topic? How much do you think your mental response helped you beat cancer?
Oh, I mean, I think you would be hard pressed to find someone that goes through a cancer experience and doesn't believe that there's mind-body connection. I mean, it's so critical to get your mind in check in order to manage it. So I saw that, like I said, you know, I took a very multidisciplinary approach to my cancer diagnosis and treatment where, not only was I getting inpatient chemotherapy and going through Western medicine, I was also doing meditation and yoga and acupuncture and massage and talking with a social worker regularly. And, I recognized that if I wasn't paying attention to my inner world and my innermost thoughts and feelings and really managing that the physical piece was not going to be able to participate in the way that it needed to. So, and I think you don't have to go through a cancer diagnosis to recognize the power of the mind in managing symptoms. Like, people that struggle with anxiety know strategies of how to calm themselves down, whether it's deep breathing or things that they're saying to themselves to try and settle themselves and to understand the situation. So I did that quite a bit. And I can even think in particular, like at the end of my treatment, I developed really horrible case of sepsis. And that was probably the worst part of the whole experience for me, because it was when I was on the way up. I was getting ready to go back to work. It was going to be my first day of work, my first day of re-entry into the world, and couldn't move. And I was totally, I was in excruciating pain and couldn't figure out why, and had this horrible infection that probably started from my port and went into my bloodstream and my urine, and it was everywhere, and it was excruciating. And it became very clear that I could die from it. I mean, it was moving very fast. Wow. And I was hospitalized for another, I want to say 5 or 6 days after that. And they couldn't get it under control for a while. And I remember even looking at my dad and looking at his hands and thinking that might be the last time I see him. I mean, I was very acutely aware of how dire my situation was. And, I think I had to do a lot of internal talk in order to calm myself during a very out of control experience. And during a period where I was least expecting it, right? I thought, I finished my marathon. What is this? Yeah. So, the mind-body connection, I think, is critical. And I think I felt lucky in the sense that, my background was in social work. My mom is a child psychologist. I had grown up in a family where we were a very emotional family and we talked about our feelings, and that helped. That was a part of why I was able to speak out about what I was experiencing and be so vocal, because there wasn't shame around feelings in my house. If anything, it was embraced, So that was a piece of it that's important.
And then what became of the blog?
It continued. And, I had a friend, and it really pissed me off. He asked me, he said, well, now that you're done with treatment, you're not going to have a blog anymore, right? Like, why do you get to be the one that tells me when my story ends, right? Or when I need to stop using it, or when I can stop needing it? That felt like that's a decision I need to make. And it eventually stopped. I mean, I didn't need it, I want to say about a year after treatment, but I was channeling my energy into the nonprofit. And I think that's why I didn't feel like I needed it anymore. But I had to kind of like reconfigure who I was and how I wanted to identify. And, you go through this, and I was sick, and then I got better, and that was the narrative that was out there. But there was all this other stuff that no one was really talking about, which is the survivorship piece, which is so complicated, and there's no guidebook, and there's no roadmap to how to get through it and how long it lasts for. And I would argue I'm still navigating it.
What do you mean? What do you mean, the survivorship?
Meaning that, you go through the experience of hearing you have cancer, you go through treatment, and I talk about survivorship as really just having heard those 3 words: you have cancer, you've survived that life-changing experience, so now you are surviving. And so I guess when I talk about survivorship, I'm also talking, for me personally, I think more about my life in a couple of phases. So there's the diagnosis period, there's the treatment period, and then there's the post-treatment period for me. And that's obviously not everyone's story. But for me, once I finished treatment, they were like, all right, see you later. Like, I don't know how to find the shoes that I left behind 8 months ago when I started this mess. I don't know who that person was. I don't know how to relate to the family and friends that I love and that I want to be close to, but I don't know how to be close to them. I don't know how to have BS conversations. I don't know how to do small talk. Like, I'm the worst person to take to a cocktail party ever. Because I could barely drink because my tolerance was totally shot with treatment. And then I just spent, 8 months thinking about, am I going to live? And that's not exactly like the best type of conversation that you want to have when you're meeting people for the first time. I was like a bit of a downer, and I had to recognize that. And I remember that I felt so happy when I experienced road rage. And it was about 6 months after treatment, because I felt like that's BS. Like, getting angry when you're in the car about some guy that's cut you off, that's nonsense, like, in the scheme of things. I felt like, oh my God, I think I'm healing. I'm getting worked up about, that.
Right.
So
interesting.
It took a while to be able to move away from really heavy type conversations to lightness. And I love that I can do that now and not feel bad about it. And I recognize when I'm doing it, when I'm having small talk,
That's so funny. I would say it's more funny on my end in that, there've been many times I used to do training sessions around networking. And I think some people are wired to not enjoy small talk. And I've always been one of those people, I have to say. But so it was good for me sometimes to train and to acknowledge that it has its role. And some people can't connect to you if you don't make any small talk, because it will be too intrusive if you just immediately leap into something that you want to, sort of meaty to talk about. And it's not very important for a context of today, but it's just funny you bring that up in the irrelevance of the trivial nature of a networking training compared to life and death matters. So, of course, what I'm most interested in next is where the idea for the nonprofit came about, or I should say, when you got the idea. What point did that idea pop into your head?
So the whole idea for Twist Down Cancer really came from the blog, where I started to realize, like I mentioned, I had this audience. I couldn't understand why people were reading in all these different countries that I had never been to, had no connection to. And so in a state of desperation, I just made a video of myself and I said, who's joining me on the dance floor? And I asked for people to do the twist, because the twist dance was all that I could manage and muster at the time.
Wow.
And in a couple of days, we had a couple thousand people twisting out cancer. And that's where it comes from. It was this very desperate call to action, and the community responded. And what was so beautiful about it was that all of a sudden I was being transported into people's homes and celebrations and events. And I felt really disconnected for a long time from the world around me. And all of a sudden I felt like I was a part of things. And so, and the beauty of video is you get to watch it as many times as you want to. So like the really good ones, I've seen multiple times that, when I was really down and out, I could look and see my friend in Dubai who's out on her balcony twisting, and, my friend with her young kids twisting, like in utero. She was showing me her twins bopping around. It was like just this amazing outpouring of love from people that I knew and also from strangers. And so after that, I was really struck with the generosity of people. And I was struck by the power of social media. This was also a long time ago. This was 2010, 2011, when things were really just picking up. And so when I finished everything and started to get better, I really was wanting to do something with my experience. And I was trying to figure out, like, how do I take this call and response idea and this whole twist idea and turn it into a nonprofit? And it wasn't something, like I said, that I was intending to do. I had always wanted to do my own thing in terms of work. Like, I had worked in the nonprofit space for years. And I knew that down the road I'd want to do something that was my own, And I kind of just felt like, okay, I've just gone through hell and back. I've survived this experience. I, for all intents and purposes, am on borrowed time right now. And so maybe I need to look at this and just try it and see where it goes. So it's not like I had this brilliant vision for Twist Out Cancer when I started. I did not. I just was feeling somewhat fearless. I didn't feel like I had a lot to lose. Mm-hmm. And I also felt like, you know, if I could just take on cancer, then like, what's the big deal if I try and build something and it fails? Yeah. Like, big deal. I'm still awesome. Here, mm-hmm. you know? So, and I will say, and I can even say this now, like, you know, my husband and I, we've been saving for a long time to try and buy a house. And this was like a dream of ours to be able to do this. And we put in a crazy offer 2 weeks ago. Mm-hmm. And my husband looked at me and he was like, it's going to get rejected. I was like, we don't have anything to lose. Like, let's just do it. Like, you know, and it was this like embracing of, again, getting back to this feeling of excitement and terror. And it's really the same thing. It's just different extensions of it. It's a fine line. And I think that the best decisions that I've ever made have happened when I have felt like, well, what is there to lose? Like when I have really, truly embraced the fear and said, we're going to just be okay with failing. It may not work. And, you know, and it was accepted. The offer was accepted. So I think that, with Twist, I just really was determined to find meaning in what I had experienced. And I really wanted to help people, bottom line. I mean, I felt like people were so generous and that I learned all these really unique lessons along the way. And I really wanted to be able to share that with other people and to have people have a safe space for them to come forward with their experiences and stories and for them to feel heard, and to really build the community that I was determined to create, and to build it so that other people could benefit from it, because I wish that I had it, you know, right from the get-go.
Right. I'm curious if you have an answer to this, and it's okay if you don't, but for people that haven't had an experience like yours themselves, what advice do you have for them in terms of being more fearless? You know, because when you talk about I didn't have anything to lose, I'm living on borrowed time, my concern is that some people listening will say, well, you know, I can't relate. Of course, right. Everybody knows people that have, you know, had serious illness and have passed away, but it's not the same until it's you.
No.
Right?
No.
So
definitely. And I don't want people to have to go through a cancer diagnosis in order to be fearless.
Exactly.
Right. So I think you have to just kind of think through, like, what's the worst that could happen? Mm-hmm. So I know I have failed at a lot of different things in my life, and even since cancer and even before cancer. And what's the worst that can happen? I have become good at apologizing, and I have gotten good at figuring out how to pivot and how to change course. And so you don't have to go through a cancer crisis or medical crisis or something really traumatic in order to be fearless. It's a choice. I mean, I'm 8 years out right now, putting in a crazy offer on something that we thought was going to get denied. Like that didn't come from cancer. That came from me choosing to say, let's take a risk. Mm-hmm. And all of the decisions now that I'm making, even with Twist, I mean, we grew so fast this year. Mm-hmm. We invested in 4 programs in different cities where we're normally just doing 1 or 2 programs a year, right? So we grew at rapid fire. It keeps me up at night. It gives me butterflies. We are moving at rapid fire pace. Mm-hmm. I also feel like I really hope it doesn't fail, and I really hope that I've built it right. But if it does, then I will take stock of what's happened, and we will figure out a new path. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? And so I don't think it's a bad thing to be scared. I think it's something that you just have to choose to embrace. I mean, I'm not saying that people should be thoughtless about the decisions and not think it through, but I think we have to take risks. And then, you know, I think I have really learned how to embrace risk taking in certain areas of my life. And I think that if there's the possibility that you can grow in the future, that it's worth the risk.
Mm-hmm.
And growth doesn't have to mean success. It can mean failure. It can mean learning from that failure.
Yeah, it's so priceless, Jenna. I mean, the words, just talking about feeling scared and being afraid of failure. I mean, those are two of the biggest stigmas that talk about emotional cancers, or maybe it's not even psychological cancers that many people have globally. Those are, the things that I think are such horrible obstacles for people. And so, any wisdom that we can get. So I so appreciate what you're sharing, because it's absolutely priceless. People have to find their own way to adopt it, but they don't want to live their entire life hidden, cowering behind those two things, because that's what stops people. This fear that somehow they're going to look bad if they fail, or they won't get over it, or that they'll go to their grave with endless regret, even though the bigger regret is that they won't have tried.
Right. Exactly.
Anyway, so this is just wonderfully inspiring things you're sharing. Talk a bit then about your nonprofit. You said we're moving at a rapid pace. Can you firstly, how so? So you said you knew. So it's two questions really. I know I'm supposed to ask one at a time. It's like, how are you growing? But I'm I'm in some ways I'm more interested in what are you doing right? Like, how come you're growing? Because obviously it's not a surprise you've hit a nerve when you talk about the things that you do, well, the reasons why you're doing it, because you found meaning, you really wanted to help people. You're also intrigued when you said, there's some unique weapons I learned that I can help other people with. Safe place, people want to feel heard, build a community. I mean, those are really compelling reasons. So in a way, you've already answered the question. But firstly, how are you growing at rapid fire?
Yeah, so we have this program, Brushes with Cancer, that matches artists with people that have been touched by cancer, and the artists are charged with creating a unique work of art reflective of that person's journey with cancer. And we have these big art exhibitions and celebratory events and art therapy-focused workshops that happen throughout the program. And so we started this back in Chicago 7 years ago, and it was really successful. It started with 150 people participating, and then we grew as much as to 800 at one event. And so it just kind of took off. And then we started to test the waters, because word started to get out about what we were doing, and it was really unique. And it was offering people a new perspective on their experiences. And it was also providing artists with an opportunity to use their skill sets to be able to help someone that's gone through something really intense. So, I knew the cancer space. I knew the patient experience. I did not know much about artists. I'm not an artist. So I had to learn a lot. And as I started to get emails from different people in my life that were saying, I want to bring it here, I want to bring it here, I had to figure out, well, how do we grow this? How do we scale it? Do we have the resources? And at that time, I was working at the Anti-Defamation League 40 hours a week, 40 plus hours a week. Wow. And this was a passion project. This was not my full-time gig. So how do I do this and replicate it in other places? And so last year we grew to include Montreal, Canada, and Tel Aviv, in addition to Chicago. And that was staggered, where it was every couple of months. So I could focus my energies on each city as it was happening. And this year, we decided to grow even further and have it in 4 cities that are actually happening back to back to back. It would have been, are you there? Sorry, Matt, you're frozen again.
Yeah,
sorry.
No,
okay,
again,
can you hear me?
Seconds. Yeah, I can hear you. Mm-hmm.
Okay. So in terms of the growth this year, so we're going to be launching the program in Philadelphia, Detroit, Austin, Texas, and Chicago. Wow. And before we were ready to do that, we created a scaling guide so that we could give literally a manual to whoever was running the program that was like a Bible that had everything that they would ever need in order to do it. And we have also built in a lot of support. So, we have lots of conference calls. We've had to get used to working virtually. I've had to really get used to giving up control and investing in people that I trust and being able to troubleshoot on the fly if things aren't going the way that they should be. So it's been a really challenging experience, but I've learned so much in the process. And it's really good for me to continue to feel like I'm growing, and that I'm also terrified, and that I'm also excited. I feel all of them. So, when we talk, hopefully again, at the end of December, hopefully I can tell you that all 4 events and programs were incredibly successful. Mm-hmm. I won't know until then, but I do think we have incredible people working with us. And I think we have thoughtfully created a great scaling model that hopefully will continue to work. And if it doesn't work, we will pivot.
Yeah. So, I mean, other ideas, or what other ideas do you have for programs?
For programs for Twist? Mm-hmm. I mean, I think right now we've really just kind of found a sweet spot with Brushes with Cancer. I think it's such a unique program, and we are really rolling out what we call these Twist shops, which are art therapy workshops led by local art therapists. And again, it's a curriculum that we've devised that we can implement in these different cities. And I think it helps with building community and getting people to feel comfortable talking about their experiences and not being as scared of, creating art. Like I said, I'm not an artist, but I love participating in these things, and I see how the creative arts can be used as a mechanism for healing. And, I think that we are really empowering a lot of people in lots of different ways. And I think also what's been so interesting about it is, the program comes and it goes, but the creativity and the spark that has sort of been put out there continues. And so I love hearing about the stories that happen after the fact, of the relationships that were built, or the new ventures or new risks that people are taking. I mean, we had an artist one year who was also a professor that switched careers entirely and decided to focus more time on the arts. I mean, we see that happen a lot, of people feeling like, okay, I've come forward with my story, I've come forward and participated, and now I feel empowered to do something bigger. Mm-hmm. So, yeah.
Jenna, I've got 3 questions to wrap things up.
Okay.
The first one is, who do you think you've become since the day you were diagnosed in 2010?
I think I've become someone that's a lot more thoughtful and reflective and grateful.
It's an additional question, but since you used the expression earlier in the conversation 2 or 3 times about you had a new normal, and you referred to it when you had cancer. I mean, maybe you just answered it, but is this your new normal? And if not, or if that's part of it, what else is part of your new normal now in terms of how you see the world?
Well, I feel really lucky that I was able to find love after cancer, and that I was able to become a mom. So cancer is a large part of my narrative, but it's not it. So if you had asked me 6 months post-treatment, how do I define myself? I would say I'm a cancer survivor. Yeah. And I'm a miracle baby, and I've also survived cancer, and I'm a loving wife. Maybe not exactly in that order, I'm not sure, but there's so many other parts of my life that are so vibrant and so present, that while I think cancer helped set the stage for what I created, and that I am continuing to grow, continuing to build this. I mean, really, I'm so motivated by helping other people manage their own crisis, that it's so much less about my own story than it is about the story of others. I feel really inspired and motivated by that.
Just to set the cancer aside for a moment, for anyone listening that at a minimum is in a funk and potentially also feeling like they've got some really heavy things that they're struggling to deal with, what do you think the best first step is for people?
So I'm a big list maker. And I like to make lists of the goals and dreams that I have that are like lofty, and the ones that are more realistic. And I also make lists that to tally up things that I've actually done that I feel proud of. And it can be as simple as, I was completely present with my daughter for the 3 hours that we had together after work, or it can be small things like that. where I feel like by acknowledging what you're doing, it allows you to take stock of where you started and where you're ending up, and allows you to set realistic and also dreamy goals.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, when my husband and daughter and I, when we moved to Philly 2.5 years ago, we saw it as an opportunity to kind of reinvent ourselves a little bit here. We had a fresh start.
Mm-hmm.
We made a really long list of all the things that we wanted to be able to do. And I can say I've done a lot of them.
Mm.
I held myself accountable. And I think the process, and when I say writing lists, I don't mean typing lists. I mean writing them, like old in a book, and crossing them out when it's done. It's so much more thrilling than deleting or checking on a phone. So that's really helped me. And that helps me manage any type of crisis or problem or funk. I can, when I see it all out on paper, it seems a lot more manageable.
I love that idea. I have to say, it's so funny because my wife and I have a date night on Friday, and I'm thinking, oh, that's exactly what we should do. We've never done anything like that. And that's a brilliant, because occasionally my wife will say something, usually to one of the children, like, oh yeah, that's on my bucket list. And I'm thinking, I didn't know that, or if I did, I thought that's on mine. And, we really should make that a bit more concrete rather than just,
right.
have it just come up once in a blue moon. So anyway, thank you that wasn't my intended question, but I just think that's I do try to make a point of implementing at least one thing for more than my conversations, but there's more than that, I assure you, from what you've said. And then the last one is how can people learn more about your nonprofits and keep in touch with you?
Yeah, so you can go to twistoutcancer.org. All of our information is up there. You can learn all about Brushes with Cancer programs and events happening in various cities. And then, of course, on social media, which is where we started. We're still alive and using. Yeah. And
I know there's videos of you twisting too that's still on your website, correct? That was that's something I did notice before we talked. I thought that's why that's amazing. That's so cool. It's better to hear it from you, I think, in person, and then to see it. So I definitely encourage anyone listening to check out those videos on the twistoutcancer.org site. So Jenna, an enormous thank you for your time. You're doing incredible work, and you have a most unbelievable story, and what you share is just as relevant to everybody, regardless of their circumstances. And so I just think that's absolutely massively priceless. I applaud what you're doing. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah, and then to those listening, yes, for goodness sake, none of us has an excuse not to be out there making more waves and building on what we already have, and being more grateful for what we have, but also taking more action and taking more risk in a good way. It's not beyond any of us to do that. The show notes from today will be on my website, matt-anderson.com, matt-anderson.com. Please subscribe to the show if you haven't already, and do leave a comment. Otherwise, again, thanks, Jenna, and listeners, again, take next steps. Don't put anyone on a pedestal. Don't assume that because you haven't had the similar experience that you're not equally capable of doing remarkable things. That is absolutely not the case. There's no superpowers that any of us possess. Otherwise, I'm going to wrap up with my favorite question, which is, what would you do if you knew you couldn't fail? I'm Matt Anderson, and this was The Road Not Taken.